Today's episode of Path to Power is brought to you by Greenman, an Irish investment management firm with over 20 years of experience.
Greenman Open is a European long-term investment fund, or LTIF. It's focused on grocery-anchored retail real estate. These are the kinds of properties that some investors believe remain essential even in uncertain markets. People still need to buy food. That's what they say makes this sector more resilient and more stable over the long term.
Unlike many alternative investment funds that are only available to professionals, Greenman Open is open to a wide range of investors with lower minimum investments and a highly regulated structure.
Just remember, all investments carry risk. Values can go up or down, and past performance isn't a reliable guide to future returns. Greenman Open is a regulated LTIF, but you should always speak to a financial advisor before investing. Learn more on the website greenmanopen.com.
Hello and welcome to this, our latest edition of Path to Power. I'm Matt Cooper.
And I'm Ivan Yates.
We're in different locations at present. I'm out of the country for a few days, but have been keeping in touch with what's going on back home and indeed what's going on internationally, which I think is where we're going to have to start with what it's going to mean for Ireland if Israel and Iran's war escalates further. And I suppose most pertinently, if the United States, Ivan, decides to get involved fully on the side of Iran, because it did strike me that the timing of all this, apart from anything else, is not the best at a time when the European Union is trying to do a trade deal with the United States, and when the United States might expect the European Union to be supportive of Israel in this war in Iran, at a time when, of course, Ireland wants to be resolutely neutral. What do you think of that particular angle?
Well, first of all, my own. If you ask me to guess, will the US go into Fordo with their bunker busting bombs? I think the answer is no, and I'll tell you why in a second. But my first position here is quite clear. In the mid-90s, I dealt with Iran in trying to sell them beef, and I'll be very frank about it. I found them utterly disingenuous. They'd promise you the sun, moon, stars. They didn't do it. They complained, and they did this, that, and the other. And for me, since 1979, the Islamic regime, in the way they've, like, women who show their hair in public are condemned, and the whole Islamic regime, I consider them bad actors, Matt. I'm not a fan of them. I think they have been involved in Shia campaigns with Hezbollah, the Houthis, Yemen, you name it, in Syria and so on. And I actually, if the choice was Iran to be degraded in terms of a regional superpower or not, I'm all in favour of it. But I think the problem for Trump is very different to any previous, to Bush or any other president, insofar as that one of the cornerstones of America First, and you will know this, is that no more forever wars. And when you look at Tucker Carlson, one of your friends, and another one, Steve Bannon, and all of those other bad actors, they have got really involved in this, saying this is exactly the type of case where America would not go into war, because you go in for a surgical strike and it doesn't happen. So I think you're going to see TACO here, talks going on, as you say, with Lamy and the EU counterparts in relation to Switzerland. But let's be clear, one of the things that moves Trump is 53% of the MAGA base are not in favour of any US alignment with Israel in this war. And, you know, to be quite frank about it, I was looking at the approval for war ratings in the polls there. It was only 16%.
Okay, a number of things there. I would share your dislike for Iran, which is deeply repressive regime against its own people, but has also been a very bad actor in relation to Ukraine, for example, is believed to have been arming Russia in its attacks on Ukraine, and has also been a major funder of terrorism within the Middle East for many years. So Iran is not a country we would want to be on the side of, which makes it quite bizarre how the government last year decided to reopen an embassy in Tehran and spent over €1.5 million in doing so. And we also had the spectacle of congratulatory letters from our president, Michael D. Higgins, to Iran on change of regime. So I don't think anyone wants to be on the side of Iran, but I don't think anyone wants to be on the side of Israel either. There's deeply suspicious the timing of what Israel is doing here, that they think the international condemnation of its atrocities in Gaza was definitely increasing. And at a time when that happened, it manages to deflect attention by a sudden attack on Iran. Now you have also the hypocrisy of Israel being outraged and furious at things like entirely wrong attacks on hospitals in Israel by Iran, when that's exactly what Israel has been doing to the people of Gaza for the last 2 years or so. A complete hypocrisy in many cases. Now, when it comes to Trump, I think the taco trade reference, which we did on this program previously, which referred to tariffs and markets, I think is likely to be carried into him doing nothing in relation to supporting Israel in its attack on Iran with these so-called bunker buster bombs, because Trump always chickens out, as TACO stands for, and he's not going to do something unless he is absolutely guaranteed that the war in Iran will succeed, and there can be no guarantees of that, and unless he can be guaranteed that he will maintain his support base in the United States. Now, we could be very wrong in relation to this, but I certainly think that it's most unlikely that Trump would want to go full metal jacket in relation to a war in Iran, thankfully. And also, you got to take into account as well that, we've been here before. We're now hearing about these bunker buster bombs. Do you remember in the previous Gulf War, it was letterbox bombs? It was all this nonsense that they could target, that they could literally drop a bomb to the letterbox and an address. You could say with drones and various things, that technology, they are able to specifically target. But the point still is that there's an awful lot of hyperbole and bullshit about what can actually be done in war, precision attacks and the rest of it. When the reality is, wars kill lots of innocent people, wars destroy, and they don't. And I suppose this is a good time for Ireland to be neutral in respect of taking neither one side nor the other. But I would fear that we will be placed under pressure to be supportive of the United States if it does get involved, in much the way, if you remember back to the Iraq War in 2003, Ivan, when, we were against the idea of war. We had people marching in the streets of O'Connell Street in significant numbers, the government condemning the war, and yet we were facilitating the Americans transporting troops and arms through Shannon Airport.
Well, in all these things, the Irish position will de facto be the EU position. The risks of what Iran could do if their back is to the wall, their regime is threatened, and America does just say take out their nuclear enrichment program. First of all, fuel prices have remained relatively steady at $75 a barrel, notwithstanding all of this conflict. Essentially, I think the Strait of Hormuz, Iran could really be destructive there, and that will be enough that would certainly prompt a recession if that happened. Incidentally, speaking of that, I was late last night surrounded by the biggest dairy executives. As you know, we sell $500 million per annum of butter, Kerrygold butter, to the States. There seems to be a little bit more optimism, Matt, that the whole EU-US tariff row, which we've discussed so much on the pod, might settle around 10%, and that people saying they could live with that, and that the UK deal has actually set a benchmark for which Europe will follow. So A, your response to that, and B, you sent me, you're trying to enjoy a little bit of R&R, and you sent me stuff about Paul Murphy. I mean, why do you want to go upset me?
We'll get to Paul Murphy in a second. The recession thing is very interesting because I think already, even though thankfully Oil prices have not rocketed. Um, Already a lot of businesses are putting back on capital investment decisions. And this isn't just Irish companies, it's international companies. The uncertainty in the world at the moment means that when it comes to hiring people or making investments in new plants and facility, whatever, and also when you ally that with uncertainty caused by how fast artificial intelligence is getting into the white collar sector, I think the chances of an economic downturn are rising, unfortunately. We've managed to avoid things for a while, or bad economic news for a while, having even managed to come through COVID and all the rest of it. But I think as these things go in cycles and with all the news that we have at present, I think we need to be concerned about the possibility of recession. And we might get in a little while to concerns that the central bank has, as well as IFAC, into the government finances and how well set we are in relation to dealing with a change in our economic position. But just going back one thing in relation to Israel and Iran as well, and the hypocrisy of Israel in relation to this. It has been, condemning Iran's nuclear program, saying Iran has been reaching the point of no return on this. Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying exactly the same thing since the 1990s. And there's actually no evidence that Iran is ready to have a nuclear bomb, let alone deploy it. The various monitors and stuff haven't indicated that Iran is weaponizing its nuclear program. It's a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and says it has a right to a peaceful nuclear program and has consistently denied it's seeking a nuclear weapon. Now, it could be lying, and it's very possible that it is lying. But don't forget, Israel has refused to become a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it's widely believed to have nuclear weapons. It has denied that, but it has never allowed for inspections and the rest of it. And I think having Israel with nuclear weapons is every bit as dangerous as having Iran with nuclear weapons, because we have seen, particularly in Gaza, the way that Israel is prepared to behave. And that is something that we should be seriously worried about.
Yeah, I actually think there's a lot more international support for what Israel's doing in Iran. There was a horrific event, I thought it was around one of the IDF feeding stations in Gaza. Just 59 people killed. Unbelievable genocide there. And I think, Israel is a pariah state. But I actually was with the German Chancellor Merz when he said there was an element of truth in the fact that Israel was doing the dirty work of the rest of the Western world, insofar as that, the extent to which Iran and the fundamentalist regime has been a force for evil cannot be overstated. They have really got involved in other Shia militia, right through the Houthis, through Hezbollah, and so on, that I actually think there's a lot more support for Israel on this issue as opposed to their pariah status on genocide. But we shall see how it works out. But I mean, look, 80% of the public of Iran, I think, want regime change. There isn't a structure for it. There isn't effective democracy. But I certainly won't shed any tears if we see the back of Ayatollah Khomeini.
But I think we also have to remember what happened in Iraq in 2003. Do you remember weapons of mass destruction? Do you remember how we were told by the neocons, and the Americans were supported particularly by Tony Blair in relation to this, that it was essential to remove Saddam Hussein from Iraq because of these weapons of mass destruction? None existed. When the Americans went in there, none existed. And what happened was it set the unintended consequences. It set a chain of reaction off, which led over the years to the rise of ISIS and other terrorist groups, destabilization of the Middle East and North Africa, and essentially the refugee crisis that we have had in Europe, which has also spread into Ireland, is one of the unintended consequences of what happened in Iraq 22 years ago. So we always have to be mindful of not repeating the mistakes of history. And while there is an evil regime in place in Iran, what is going to be the replacement? We have unfortunately seen in some circumstances in the Middle East that the alternative becomes worse. So should the Western world be involved in making decisions for people in that region? And again, when it comes to it again, I suspect there are people in the United States as well who are looking at what Israel is doing in Iran and are possibly thinking, like they did in Iraq, can we get our hands on oil supplies? Is there a way to enrich ourselves? But the thing with Trump, I still come back to as well, is Trump always chickens out. The taco trades, I think, and hopefully I'm right about this one, hopefully he will chicken out and will not support an escalation by Israel of this war, an escalation by means of the United States pitching in with its army and air force as well.
Meanwhile, you were spared. You were spared a horror, in my view, on Monday. We had some people described it for me as Halloween for, what's the word that rhymes with bankers that starts with a W? This was the great and the good and the most pretentious in Ireland gathering together at Dublin Castle for the National Economic Dialogue, no less. So basically someone else said to me that, you know, the way Bloomsday is, you know, kind of for wannabe thespians, the National Economic Dialogue is for wannabe statespeople. But really what it is where dreams go to die. And the fact of the matter is that we've had the usual showboating, but I found some of it deeply offensive. For example, the leader of the, Congress of Trade Unions, Mr. Kevin Callan, brother of John Callan, Secretary General to the Government and Cabinet Secretary, came out and said that one of the things the government shouldn't do is reduce the VAT on the hospitality sector in the autumn 2026 budget, as promised in the election, as promised in the programme for government, from 13.5% to 9%. And he turned around and he said, oh, well, the reason we shouldn't support the hospitality sector is because it only has low-paid jobs. And I just thought in one sentence, because he wants well-paid jobs for more members for him, here you have the conflict in the Irish society and economy. There's about 220,000 people working across the hospitality sector. I know of nobody who gets up earlier, works later, works through the weekend than different elements of the hospitality sector. And the nature of it is they're begging and scraping to keep their patrons happy. And, they're raising very serious revenues in VAT, in payroll taxes, about 7 billion contribution to the Irish economy. And here are the good and the great in the sheltered sector. Parasitic people. I don't know if you saw Mandy Johnson had a fantastic article about why Doge is needed here. She's explained the malaise, government spending up 3.7 billion this year, an extra 50,000 civil servants are now employed. All these figures, the total of 425,000 people on the state payroll. They're being paid for by the likes of the hospitality sector. And like when I hear so many anecdotes of complete lack of accountability, complete lack of performance and productivity and output in the public sector. The fact of the matter is this national economic dialogue was a bit of a joke, and we need to find some way of connecting the real economy with these spoofers in the public sector who think they're running the country, but they're actually parasites on the country.
Okay, I hadn't really prepared for that one because I actually hadn't read Mandy's piece, which I presume was in the Business Post at the weekend. And I think what was interesting from what I saw of the National Economic Dialogue at that forum in Dublin Castle, one of the things that we spoke of last week on this podcast came up on the agenda. Two-tier child benefit system looks like it will be coming in an effort to try and address child poverty. I wonder, from the government's point of view, how much of that particular event is designed just to sort of like to go through the motions to make people feel a greater involvement than perhaps they have. I mean, remember, we haven't had national pay agreements now for about a decade and a half, is it? That the sort of the structure that was there for the Celtic Tiger era is long gone. So the trade union movement does not have the type of influence that it once had. I suppose what I was more interested in was reading the various scenarios that the central bank has outlined, that if things go wrong because of potential war or because of the war between Israel and Iran, if that has more economic impacts as to how it'll impact on our um, tax revenues, particularly corporation tax. And they've looked at various scenarios, including one where we lose all of the so-called windfall corporation taxes and could end up in a situation where we're running deficits of up to 17 billion euro per annum, assuming that there aren't other measures taken to try and reduce that, which would imply that the days of austerity could actually return again. And I suppose what there is going to be, as you highlighted last week as well, there is going to be, at least in the short term, an increase in the tax take because the 15% corporation tax receipt revenues don't come into play until around next year. And that could provide an extra 2 or 3 billion euro a year in unexpected revenues. But I think that money is going to have to be diverted into a savings fund for the inevitable rainy day that actually is going to come. And yeah, I can understand as well why there would be concern, as you have outlined to me, Mandy Johnson is saying that we have, and I think we focused on this last week as well, that government spending is going ahead of profile and the rest of it. And you do have to wonder, what are we actually getting for that? But sorry, there's one thing I want to come back to. We jumped on and you seem unimpressed by
can I just can I just go back to one thing? Because you actually put your finger on, I was trying to say, well, did anything useful come out of the National Economic Dialogue? And like, just to get on my goat, social justice came out, that we need to increase the tax take target per capita. We need to raise tax levels to 26,800 per capita. And we should target an extra 26 billion in taxes to pay for all this nonsense. But look, the one thing I said, oh, that's interesting. Micheál Martin said we're going to have a 2-tier rate of child benefit. And I said to myself, okay, so for the first time in the history of the state, instead of universal child benefit, which is sort of stuck on €140 a month, going to the wealthiest parents in the same fashion as going to the poorest parents in the country, at last they're going to look at that. And then you read the small print. So I was following it up because, as you know, for years, the revenue commissioners and Department of Social Protection said, oh no, administratively we can't do this. So what did I find was actually at the heart of this? No, we're not going to means test child benefit. No, we're not going to take it off Michael O'Leary's children. We're not going to do anything that would give equity in targeting resources. We're actually going to have a 2-tier rate that anyone below a certain level, for 100,000 kids, we're going to spend another 700 million on child benefit. So instead of taking the hard decision of introducing equity and targeting resources, we're taking the soft option. We'll spend another 773 million on a benefit that'll never be eroded. It just goes on and on. So the glimmer that there might be some reform, actually no. It's the same old thing, just throw more money at the problem.
Okay, just before we go to the break, should we've highlighted him once so far, the Irish Greta Thunberg, Paul Murphy, TD. How impressed were you by his attempts to bring aid to Gaza, stopped twice by the Egyptian authorities, and suffering the 21st century indignity of having his phone taken from him?
Well, see, you're getting into stand-up now. I mean, the fact of the matter is that, one of his real sort of crusading principles is on all his social media tags, not that I bother with them, people tell me about them, he is a real committed campaigner for transgender issues. And of course, when he went to Egypt, he took that off his site and all his ID stuff. That's point one. Point two, he seemed disappointed that he wasn't harassed more. He seemed the loss of his phone, which, is all about, and he missed this, raise the roof. There's quite a lot happening on housing this week, I have to tell you. A really significant developments taking place on housing. And I want to tell you about a London conference where actually there looks like there could be a surge of investment for the private rented sector coming through. This is a publicity stunt, Matt. I mean, the fact is, in this era of social media, you know, here we are now being manhandled by the Egyptian authorities. You know what I mean? Like, please, like this, the issue of Gaza is absolutely a humanitarian crisis. It is an outrage. But it isn't aided or abetted in terms of highlighting it or getting justice for Palestinian people by someone just showboating for social media publicity in a personal way just to keep his profile up. I find it, sorry, I'm a bit cynical about it.
Clearly, in fairness, I will say that I don't doubt he is sincere in his motivation, in that he believes genuinely about the need for aid to go into Gaza. So we have to give him that. But I do wonder as to, other than raising his own profile back in Ireland, as to what practical benefit it actually did for anybody in Gaza. There's lots of things I think we want to talk about after we've had the break. You've mentioned housing. I want to talk about nursing homes again. And I also think we should remember the late Lord Henry Mount Charles, who would have been known to most people because of the Slane Castle concerts. But I suspect you knew because of his time as a Fine Gael candidate in the 1990s, in the 1992 general election, and also in the Shannon election in 1997, where he was unsuccessful, which may have been a pity because he was a fantastic character, and we will pay tribute to him when we come back after the break.
This episode of Path to Power is brought to you by Greenman, an Irish investment management firm. Greenman Open focuses on investing in grocery-anchored retail real estate, designed to generate stable, long-term income. The fund is managed in Ireland. Learn more on the website greenmanopen.com.
Now, before making any investment, it's important to understand the risks. Investments could go up or down, and past performance is not a reliable guide to future results. Greenman Open is a regulated LTIF, but like all investments, it carries risks. You should always seek advice from a financial professional before investing.
Welcome back to the second part of Path to Power. Ivan, I want to talk a little bit about nursing homes, and we have mentioned it in recent weeks. The scandal of the two facilities owned by Amias, the French company previously known as Orpea, which I think changed its name because of a major scandal in France about the way it was treating patients there. And the RT Investigates programme outlined horrific practices, maltreatment of patients in these facilities whose dignity at the very least was being imperiled. Shocking stuff, I think, has led people to raise many questions about the standard of care in our nursing home facilities. But a few things I want to put to you here. Kieran O'Donnell, the Minister of State for Older People, this week was in front of the Oireachtas Health Committee talking about this. We had Micheál Martin in the Dáil saying the nuclear option is to close nursing homes for significant failings, which we'll see if that happens, because we have a shortage of nursing home capacity in the country, and that capacity is going to be needed more in the future. We have at present about 3% of our over 65s need care, and that proportion increases to over 1/3 for the over 85s. We're living longer. We live, for the most part, healthier lives, which is a good thing. But it also means more people are going to need some form of care in later life when they're unable to support or provide for themselves in their own home. So we also know that on average, when somebody enters a nursing home, they may spend about 2 years there. And the majority of those who go into nursing home care do not return to their own homes before they die. We have a significant shortage of beds required. It's reckoned that by 2030, the shortage of beds will be anywhere between 10 and 15,000. We've had a number of reports done in relation to this. KPMG did one in 2022 for the National Treatment Purchase Fund. HICWA knows all about this as well. So the point is, we had Kieran O'Donnell giving out this week about private facilities. And he has decided to have a report commissioned, which he wants by September, looking into the potential financial and patient care risks from what was described as the increased privatisation of the nursing home sector. Very interesting that he just wants to focus on the private nursing home sector. The private nursing home sector makes up 75 to 80% of all nursing homes in Ireland. The state is only at around 20% provision, right? So that has happened because of a consistent underinvestment for years by the state in nursing homes. A bit like the way they want to leave residential accommodation to the private sector, they want to leave nursing home care to the private sector as well. And you can have considerable concerns as to whether these places run for profit do enough for the patients or those who are living in care there. However, HICWA itself this week said that there are 95 nursing homes around the country currently subject to various restrictions because they've not met standards or pose a risk to residents. But of that 95, only 23 are privately owned. Those directly operated by the HSE, 52 of the homes, which are currently subject to various restrictions. This is quite extraordinary. Is this a case that Kieran O'Donnell and the government has decided only have a look at what's going on in the privately run homes because we don't want it to be exposed what might be going on in the publicly funded and run institutions? What do you think, Ivan?
Well, a number of things. It is good to see the Oireachtas committees getting to grips with this, and this comes after the RTE programme Primetime Investigates, which revealed in Glasnevin and Portlaoise these particular problems. I have never been a fan of the effectiveness of HICWA. They always seem to be some regulation. There was a major review of all this in 2017, and they were asked what powers they want. They're now saying they can't get at the corporates. I think they have powers. I think HICWA actually haven't been that effective on any front as a watchdog. Couple of interesting things. First of all, you're absolutely right. I was looking at the figures for the demographics between now and in 15 years' time. The cohort 65 to 74 is going to go from 450 to 625,000. Slightly older 75 to 84 from 225,000 to 433. And the really high dependency people over 85 is going to go from 84,000 to 208,000. So the proportion of our population that is going to be over 65 as potential requiring care, long-term care, is going to go from 15% of the population to 24% of the population. The second thing I thought was really interesting was the perception, Matt, is that this is a license to print money. And EMIS, they're very poor, I think, track record and so on. But I was looking at the CRO figures. They have accumulated losses of 223 million. They bought out, I think, an Irish group of nursing homes in 2020, the TLC nursing home portfolio. But it has been a basket case. They lost in 2023 70 million, and the kind of pressures with the staff shortages. Look, your point is well made in terms of whether it's county homes or public institutions, some of which have actually been taken over when instead of closure, the HSE had to take them over. Look, this is going to get worse. The pressures on it are going to get worse. What I would say is that obviously we need a planned response to this. We need to calculate the number of beds required. We maybe need to look at, what community care facilities can be done in certain circumstances. And the worst of all is a bed costing $2,500 a day in an acute hospital is the most expensive place to treat these people. So, it needs a systemic, we're down to the politics of the last atrocity where people are grandstanding on this, but we need a considered response.
Well, I'll give you a few more figures that would be, I think, of concern. Do you know there's a projection that the number of people in this country living with dementia in 20 years' time will be over 150,000 people. And I think most people try wherever possible, if they have elderly parents or partners who have dementia, they try and live with them at home for as long as possible. But the time does come where nursing home care may be required. 150,000 people in 20 years' time with dementia is an extraordinary number that will have to be provided for. The state has, just like when it comes to housing, the state has outsourced nursing home care to the private sector. And not only that, many times when the state is stuck not knowing what to do with somebody who is ready for discharge from an acute hospital, but who can't be returned to their own home, the state goes to these private nursing home operators and it pays for people to be moved out of the hospitals into these private nursing homes. The state's failure to provide, the state did get involved in a public-private partnership using funding from the European Investment Bank of about €250 million a few years ago, providing 530 new beds around the country. But most of those were not additional beds. Those were replacements for facilities that were long out of date. Just to say in relation to RPA, as it used to be known, EMIS as it's known now, you mentioned how it had bought TLC. It bought a whole range of other operators as well around the country. It has about 2,000 beds in Ireland at present. But the reason it made those big losses partly is because it overpaid for the assets just before we had the downturn because of COVID. So the losses are partly down to writing off what it overpaid to buy these particular nursing home facilities. But what it hasn't done is hasn't actually invested in building new bed capacity. All it did was buy existing operations in place. So we're not adding enough numbers. A lot of the private operators have come up and bought what was there previously. Now, there also is concerns that the way that the state funds nursing homes, it does go through the National Treatment Purchase Fund and other methods. It actually contributes to keeping people in these privately run nursing homes. But it actually gives more money to the HSE facilities. So a larger portion of the budget, a disproportionate amount, goes, and there isn't the same checks and balances on how the money is spent in the public sector. And part of the problem that the private sector actually has in relation to getting properly trained and qualified staff is that it gets outbid by the public sector institutions or nursing homes, which have been given more money by the state to do so. So I think there's a much bigger story here. And I think this idea of another report by Kieran O'Donnell, the Minister for Older People, focusing on what's going on. He says he doesn't like these groups, as in sort of implying that he only wants individual standalone nursing homes. I think that's a little bit of a deflection from what is going on. Now, I also want to ask you about, you mentioned housing. And I saw you sent him congratulations on LinkedIn. Paul Reid, the former boss of the HSE, has taken on a new role as chair of what essentially is on board Planola, but it has a new name for overseeing all of the planning in this country. And I see the Business Post was reporting that he's getting a higher degree of pay than actually had been advertised for the position. So what do you make of Paul Reid going in as a sort of a planning supremo?
Well, first of all, it completely gets on my goat that the media coverage about this has been whether he gets 30,000 or 50,000. Like, the level of political reporting and analysis in this country is so superficial to actually create a market for podcasts, to be honest with you. The fact of the matter is that Paul Reid is known for the pandemic and the HSE and a lot of the things he accelerated. He actually really moved forward on digital technology and so many things just to respond to the crisis. But he spent 5 years as CEO of Fingal County Council, which is the largest housing development area at the present time. He is very familiar with the issues. So what Paul needs to do, and I think absolutely the government should be pro solving the housing crisis vis-a-vis on Bord Pleanála. I've given you so many examples, but in the likes of Dundrum, in the likes of Docklands in Cork, these developments have to get the green light if we're going to build a number of houses. Like the figures out from IPAV are absolutely shocking from the CSO for April. You know, they're saying the number of new homes actually sold this year from a transaction could be as low as 15,000. So, first of all, I welcome Paul Reid because he's a doer rather than a talker. All those people at the National Economic Dialogue, you know who you are. So basically, Paul is in a position to make a pivotal change that would ensure that the right commissioners who will ensure development. Now, remember, we've been down this road before. What happened with Simon Coveney when he was Minister of Health? In 2018, he got the most proactive guy, David Walsh, who is an assistant secretary in the Department of Health, and they put him in where they're putting Paul Reid in now to get this sorted. And things got worse. So the fact of the matter is that I welcome his appointment simply because he has a practical results outcome-led approach to problems rather than another report. And I don't think it'll take him too long. He could speak to John Downey, Tom Phillips and a few other planners over a pint in Dunleary and find out what's really going on with Bord Pleanála and get this stuff moving. But a couple of really, really significant developments. And I hope these come to light. We immediately could get 9,000 more units built if we changed what was called, in 2022, we announced the abolition of a thing called Build to Rent. Build to Rent is studio apartments, co-living facilities which suit single people in their 20s and 30s who come here to work in central Dublin and have no accommodation. It was simply on the basis, oh no, we don't want people in dog boxes. That professor of bullshit, Owen O'Brien, decided this. And basically, Dara followed him by the nose and said, no, we'll get rid of Build to Rent. We can't do this. So Build to Rent is going to be brought back in. The dual aspect and the apartment spec is going to be changed. But I heard there was a big conference in London this week of all the big pension funds who both do Build to Rent and would be involved in the private renter sector. Remember, in 2 years, no private rented sector deal has been done. Apartment building has gone from 2 billion a year to 150 million a year. It is the reason for the collapse in the figures last year and going forward. And actually, the response, which would surprise me because I thought, the rent cap of inflation, they actually could see a surge, particularly of stuff that's already built that they want to get a rent roll on. But someone who actually went to that conference and it was an expo and so on, quite skeptical that there would be a breakthrough of the 14 billion a year that's needed of international capital, that they actually came away and said, you know what, this just might work. And I was, as a skeptical person about it, I was quite impressed. The other thing was, you have
hold on 1 second.
Okay.
1 second. I just want to come back there on because you mentioned bed sits, and I suppose it was one of the unintended consequences of what I thought was a very well-motivated campaign led, I suppose, by the Greens initially in government back around the time the Celtic Tiger, and then followed by Labour in the government with Fine Gael after 2011 to get rid of the bed sits on the basis that there was an awful lot of substandard accommodation, particularly in our cities, but also in a lot of our towns, and a lot of bad landlords who were prepared to take money from people for living in crappy accommodation. I suppose what happened was a certain degree of the law of unintended consequences applied in relation to this, in that what happened was an awful lot of people ended up sharing houses, and the houses weren't all en suite for each bedroom. So what you would actually have is actually a situation whereby, say, for example, a group of students or a group of people, say, who had finished college, but before they were able to buy or rent their own individual place, might be sharing with others. They would end up sharing bathroom facilities. So they might as well have been in bed sits with a toilet and a shower down the corridor that was shared with other people. It didn't actually have the same the impact that had been intended. But I can understand why it was that there was a desire to improve the living facilities. And I think there are some developers who will give crappy bedsit type things, studios, I think they like to call them in the modern parlance, which are not really particularly suitable for purpose. So, let's take that into account. But at the same time, I do understand there is a line that I think you've used before, which comes from a number of developers, is that not everybody can drive a Mercedes or a BMW, that, some people have to be driving secondhand Fiats or Opels or whatever it is. And this something similar applies to housing. But by the same token, a car has to be roadworthy before it's allowed on the road, and a place that a person lives in has to be suitable to live in, rather than being something that you can put up with that. No, I can carry on.
Well, no, hold on a second. Like, I could bring you some of the build-to-rent facilities that have been built in, for example, Cork Street. Every one of them is full, Matt. There's nobody actually there complaining. It suits younger people. This is not going to be a permanent home, but it facilitates them in a city centre location. But the thing that's really got on my wick this week is that, if we're going to get this 14 billion of investment to solve the housing crisis per annum, we must get the International Pension Fund. So they do, and we alluded to this last week, collective investment vehicles. So this accelerates supply. It gets affordability through large scale, 9,000 built to rent, but another 25,000 apartments and so on. And so basically, what has Owen O'Brien come up with? An idea. Because he says, the tax treatment of this is 0 to 20% because they pool the capital from investors. He's completely missing the point that actually when they pay out dividends out of the vehicle, people are taxed at the marginal rate. So actually the tax treatment for people who invest in these collective investment vehicles is the same. He's proposing to abolish these, and if they weren't available, you will have no mega projects in this country. The revised Clonliffe, Liffey West, so on. Cherrywood would not have been built but for these investment schemes. And so, we need to narrow the gap between supply and demand. So actually, they're tax neutral. It's just while the process is going on and they're being rolled over. But I also had a discussion because, a lot of people have simplistically said, including Mr. Matt Cooper, that 150 billion of savings can be redeployed because look at this French Livret A scheme. And so I actually got someone to do a paper for it on me. So the details of the Livret A scheme is deposits are 100% state guaranteed. There's a maximum of 22,950 per investor, per depositor. They have full liquidity, but it only goes to fund social housing. So the applicability of a scheme here, which would maybe get sort of 30 billion, 3 billion a year over 10 years, it'll take a decade to set it up, would be to fund the AHBs, the approved housing bodies for social and affordable schemes. But there is no way a retail investor or the state in terms of guarantee can take on developer risks. It has to be a situation where there's a stream of income. But the problem on that is, like I was interviewing Clúid this week in relation to refurbishing retrofit, for fuel poverty. And I said, now, if you spend 50 grand doing up someone's house, putting new insulation, doing state of the art, can you raise the rent to recover your 50? Oh, no. It's a differential rent scheme. The rent is the rent. So you can see now what's brewing here. What's brewing here is that people in Deeper are going to say, when you come back after July, I don't know how long you're going to be away, but the point about it is this, that when we get back, they're going to say, okay, we'll give you 13 billion for Irish Water, we'll give you the extra infrastructure, but we're not going to willy-nilly, because there's been a big row, 485 particular houses with an AHB. They've withdrawn approval from it. So you can see the line of travel here, that there's going to be a serious lack of funding for AHBs because they feel they're on the hook for 20 years of subsidised living. So the bottom line here is that maybe the state should be looking at something for a savings scheme for specifically approved housing bodies to finance them, because Deeper ain't going to finance them.
Okay, so basically, a couple of things I need to say. I'll be back to eyeball you in the studio next Friday. Don't worry, I'm not going to be away for long. But You say that I never looked for the full 150 billion to be put into housing, but I do believe a significant portion of it could be made available through a cleverly constructed scheme to facilitate the construction of housing and providing an income flow on the basis of rents for the people who put up that money. And it would give them a better return than they are getting in low interest rate deposits in the banks at present. But I want to come back to something that you said earlier in your defense of build to rent, that people are happy to be there for a couple of years before they move on to their own home. And that's the problem, Ivan. There aren't new homes for them to move on to. And this has been the state policy since after the crash, which is often not understood enough, a belief that there would be a much bigger number of people would never be in a position where they should be allowed to get mortgages to purchase their own home, that they wouldn't have sufficient income to do so, that they would become permanent renters. And that is not something that many Irish people are particularly happy with, the fact that home ownership rates are falling, because owning your own home provides a level of security, it provides stability, it provides a place where you'll have in your pensionable years when you won't be able to go out and earn the money to pay the high rents that you're on. And we're talking at the moment almost exclusively about bringing in these institutional investors who will build these apartments that people can rent. But who's building the houses that people can actually buy? Who's building the houses that people can actually afford to buy? That is where we have a crisis developing, where we have generations of people in their 20s, 30s and 40s who feel they're never going to be in a position that they will find somewhere that they can afford to buy, and that these houses aren't been built for them. So while all the conversations that we've been having in recent weeks about increasing housing supply have been about increasing the amount of supply for rent, it hasn't been doing enough to deal with those who actually want to buy. Okay, listen, a couple of things quickly before we finish up. Two people that I know you want to talk about who have passed away, one of whom I knew well, and very sorry that unfortunately I wasn't in a position to be able to attend his funeral this week. That was Phillip Molloy, the former news editor of the Irish Independent, who I would have worked with for a number of years and would have had quite a few evenings in the Oval on Middle Abbey Street, sinking pints and talking about newspapers and politics and movies and sport and various other things. He was an absolutely brilliant journalist, and he used to be at loggerheads a lot of the time with Vinnie Doyle, the editor of the Irish Independent, but they actually, I think, had a great mutual respect, even if they may have gone about things slightly differently. They were two of the best newspaper people that I've ever come across. But the second one, Lord Henry Munn Charles, who, as I said earlier, was a former Fine Gael candidate in the 1992 general election, and the Seanad in 1997 didn't succeed on either occasion. I suppose I've been known to everybody for all of the enormous world-class acts that he brought to Slane for the concerts. But I'll just tell one little story about him. What I didn't realise was just what absolutely great fun he was to meet on a night out. You know, sometimes you get sort of rare occasions where it's totally unexpected. You end up in the company of a group of people that you hadn't known and you hadn't expected to be, and you end up on the beer with them till about 3 a.m, and you end up having the best fun evenings. And that happened with me with Henry Munn Charles. It would have been, I'd say maybe about 20 years ago. And there's a group you might be familiar with, Ivan, because it comes from your tradition, shall we say. It's a group called the Lord Taverniers. They have sort of dinners in Dublin a few times a year, black tie event. You're shaking your head there, but I'm sure you must have been at some of these men-only events. And a friend of mine, Alan Lewis, who's the former Irish cricket captain, former international rugby referee, dragged me along one night to this event. Where I think everyone just sort of does your side of funny handshakes, Ivan, and the rest of it. And a very cordial evening it was and the rest of it. But we ended up going with Henry Munn Charles, and I think it was Stephen Brewer as well, to Reynard's afterwards. And we were there till 3 a.m, and Henry Munn Charles told stories about the various acts coming into Slane and about various people in politics. And he was utterly hilarious. It was one of the funniest nights I remember actually having. He was such good fun and good crack. So I was sad to hear. I think he's lived with cancer for about a decade, and has certainly impacted his final years dramatically. But he was one hell of a character, and he did the States some service, certainly, by the way that he managed to open up Slane and the great days that many people enjoyed there. What would your recollections of him be?
My recollections of him were, I think he was quite pally with John Bruton, and he was encouraged to get involved in politics, and he was not only looking at the Dáil, but also looking at standing for Europe. And he was really quite unsuccessful insofar as that the marbly accent and all of that thing and being a lord was really unsaleable to the Irish electorate or even to Fine Gael delegates. So put it like this, I'm interested in the backstory, but what him and Jim Aiken did to get, this kind of amphitheatre, natural facility, to have David Bowie there and Neil Young and U2 and so on. Actually, I think there will be lifetime memories for a certain age group of that, and might never happen again. As regards Phillip Molloy, he was not only a regular in News Talk, but back in the day, around 2008-9, back in the Pepper Canister days, I used to fill in for George, or I was a guest on the show, and basically I was a complete novice, as I still am. But the point about it is this, that he was kind of assistant editor, and he would, the pre-briefing meetings and what angle are you going to take on this, who's the guest and that. He actually was riding shotgun over that. Now, I don't know, whether he fell out with George or whatever, but he was actually quite an intense guy. He's originally from Wexford, and Wexford town itself, Molloy's pub, would have been well known, but he was an absolute ace journalist, a man of absolute integrity, and he died quite young. They're 76, both of them in their 70s. So our deepest sympathy to both families. Now, for the bonus episode, because we're way out of time, like I am very expensive. I'm looking at a clock here, it says 57 minutes. Like, I'm sort of budgeted to talk for 46, and I get very expensive and irritable after 46. But we haven't got to the latest on the presidency, the real internecine bitterness between Mary Lou and Micheál in the Dáil chamber, significant breakthrough in the electricity market, an amazing story from Malahide of red tape and bureaucracy, and so much more.
Indeed, so much more. I mean, to be honest, Ivan, at the 57 minutes, I think you spoke for about 47. So I don't know what you're complaining about.
That suited you this week anyway.
So you have the agenda set out for the special bonus edition that is available to subscribers. I'll be back in Dublin next Friday to eyeball Ivan and perhaps make a few more interruptions than I got the chance to this week. Anyway, thank you to all of you for listening. Please subscribe and listen to the bonus edition. But if you don't, we'll talk to you next week. Goodbye.